This is the story of March 14, 1992. Detroit, Michigan. A night that no one saw coming. A night that those present would not mention publicly for years. A night about which the protagonists never spoke to each other after it ended. This is the story that existed in whispers for nearly 3 decades, in locker rooms, in private conversations among former players, in the back hallways of a sport that protects its own legends with religious ferocity. This is not what they told you. This is what happened. To understand that night, you first have to understand what existed between these two men. It was not simple sports rivalry. It was not the natural competition between two players who wanted the same trophy. What existed between Isiah Thomas and Michael Jordan was something older, more primitive, more personal. It was the kind of hatred that is only born when two men recognize in the other exactly what they are and exactly what they fear. Jordan was 28 years old in 1992. He was already a basketball deity, but he still hadn't won anything. The Detroit Pistons, Isiah Thomas's team, had blocked his path to the championship in 1988, in 1989, and in 1990. 3 times. 3 consecutive years of playoffs in which Detroit's bad boys had taken that god under construction and turned him into an ordinary man. Isiah Thomas's hands had touched the trophy that Jordan desperately sought. 3 times. And Isiah knew it. What few people know, what documentaries and sports history books rarely mention in detail, is that the war between these two men was not limited to the official courts. There existed a darker, more personal dimension that unfolded in spaces that television cameras never reached. I first heard about that night in 2011. I was interviewing Marcus Webb, a training assistant who had spent 4 years with the Pistons in the late 80s and early 90s. We had talked for 2 hours about the team's dynamics, about Chuck Daly's training methods, about the balance between physical talent and psychological warfare that defined those bad boys. The formal interview had ended. The recordings were saved. That was when Marcus said something that stopped me completely. There was one night, he told me, looking toward the window, when Isiah did something I shouldn't have seen, something no one should have seen. He asked me to sit down, to listen calmly, not to interrupt. And then he told me. The context is this. Detroit in March 1992 was a city living in the shadow of what it had been. The Pistons had won the championship in 1989 and 1990, 2 consecutive rings. Isiah Thomas was the undisputed king of a franchise that had transformed the way the world understood defensive basketball. But 1992 smelled different. The Chicago Bulls were emerging as something the sport had never seen before. Jordan, finally freed from the system that had limited him, operating within Phil Jackson's triangle offense, was literally unstoppable. And what was worse for Isiah, for his team, for his entire identity as a player, everyone already knew it. The journalists were saying it. The analysts were confirming it. The people on the streets of Detroit were whispering the inevitable. The era of the bad boys was ending, and the era of Jordan was beginning. Isiah Thomas was not the kind of man who accepted that narrative in silence. Marcus Webb described Isiah to me during that season in a way that I found fascinating. He was not the smiling Isiah, the charismatic leader who seduced everyone with that boyish smile. He was something more concentrated, colder, like a man who had decided something internally and was executing a plan that no one else could fully see. The challenge began, according to Marcus, after a closed practice, a Tuesday afternoon. The Palace of Auburn Hills was almost empty. Only internal staff and a few players who had decided to stay after the official session. Isiah approached one of the assistants, a man named Terry who had connections in the Bulls' inner circle, and gave him a message. A specific verbal message that had to reach Michael Jordan. The message was simple and devastating in its precision. Isiah wanted to play against Jordan, not in an official game, not in an all-star game with cameras and referees and 50,000 people watching. A private session, just the two of them. No teams, no massive spectators, no institutional rules to protect either of them, just the court, the ball, and the truth. The conditions Isiah proposed, according to what Marcus remembered with extraordinary clarity 19 years later, were specific and revealing. No one outside a circle of 5 people on each side could be present. No cameras, no phones, no kind of recording. A pure one-on-one, first to 11 points, no advantages, no referee, just 2 players. And one final condition, the one Marcus remembered most sharply because it was the one that had disturbed him the most when he heard it. If Jordan didn't want to go, fine. But if he went, he couldn't leave before the game ended no matter what happened. Jordan accepted. not immediately. 4 days passed. 4 days in which the message was processed, analyzed, probably discussed with close people. But Jordan accepted. And that, Marcus said, already told you everything you needed to know about the two men. Isiah had sent the challenge because he couldn't not send it. It was who he was. Jordan had accepted because he couldn't not accept. It was who he was. The place was a private gym on the outskirts of Detroit. A space that belonged to a former college player who had enough discretion not to ask questions and enough distance from the world of professional basketball so that no one would connect it to either of them. The court was small, wooden, with the lines painted correctly, but without any other sign of professionalism. 2 hoops, a manual scoreboard on the wall, cold artificial light falling directly onto the wood. They arrived separately, 20 minutes apart. Jordan first, Isiah after. Jordan arrived with 2 people. Isiah also arrived with 2 people plus Marcus, who was there for reasons he himself described as having been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They didn't greet each other when Isiah entered. Jordan was warming up at the right hoop, fluid movements, unhurried, with that characteristic economy of energy of great athletes who never waste a gram of effort before it's necessary. He saw Isiah enter. He kept warming up. Isiah took the left hoop. He began his own warm-up ritual. He didn't look to the other side either. Marcus described those 15 minutes to me as the most tense he had ever experienced inside a gym, and he said that in the context of having been present in the Pistons' locker room during 7 playoff games that were decided in the last seconds. It was the silence of 2 men who knew exactly what was at stake, he told me. Not money, not statistics, something that has no name in official basketball, but exists at the core of all great players. The certainty of knowing who you really were when there was nothing left to protect you. There was no ceremony when it began. Isiah took the ball, walked to the midcourt line, and simply said, 11 points. Jordan nodded. What followed in the first minutes was what Marcus described as the diagnostic period. Neither of them played at maximum intensity immediately. They were reading, observing, measuring. Isiah recognizing Jordan's movement patterns, his tendencies to the right, the way he loaded his weight on stops. Jordan studying Isiah's guard, his predisposition to change hands, the speed of his first step. It was basketball at a speed that seemed normal until you realized that all that apparent normality was actually 2 extraordinary intelligences operating at full capacity. The first 4 points fell slowly, 1 for Isiah, 1 for Jordan, 1 for Isiah, 1 for Jordan. Marcus said those first points were almost courteous, as if both were establishing the right tone before what they knew was coming. Then Jordan made a left-handed layup that Isiah didn't anticipate, and the game changed. It wasn't the layup that changed it. It was what Jordan did afterward. Nothing. He said nothing. He didn't celebrate, didn't gloat, didn't look at Isiah with any recognizable expression. He simply picked up the ball, walked to the back, and waited for the next play with a completely blank expression. And that emptiness, according to Marcus, was more devastating to Isiah than any verbal provocation Jordan could have attempted, because it told him that Jordan wasn't emotionally involved, that he was simply executing. Isiah Thomas, unlike almost every player of his generation, had something that coaches described with different terms depending on the moment: exceptional competitiveness, winner's mentality, elite athlete pride. But the most honest description was simpler. Isiah couldn't tolerate losing to someone who didn't respect him while beating him, and Jordan's indifference lit him up. The next 3 points came from Isiah with a speed that surprised Marcus even years later when remembering it. They weren't elaborate plays. It was cutting, direct, unadorned basketball. First-step penetrations that exploited a centimeter of advantage Isiah created with his body before the ball moved. Shots from inside the area that arrived before Jordan could position himself. A reading of the game that, even in that small private space, was genuinely extraordinary. But Jordan responded. And there resided the true horror of that night for Isiah Thomas, the horror that it took Marcus 20 years to put into words. Jordan responded without visible effort. Every point Isiah scored, Jordan matched or surpassed with the same neutral expression, the same economical movements, that same absence of emotion that said more clearly than any verbal statement, "This doesn't cost me. This is you at your maximum level. This is me at a level lower than what I can reach." At 5 points for Jordan and 4 for Isiah, Marcus remembered thinking that the game was going to end in an orderly way, that both would leave with their private conclusions and the matter would remain locked in that gym forever. Then Isiah did something no one expected. He stopped completely. He halted in the middle of the game with the ball in his hand and looked directly at Jordan for several seconds without speaking. Jordan returned the look with that same disconcerting neutrality. "Why don't you talk?" Isiah finally said. His voice sounded different, lower, more concentrated. "Everybody talks when they play. You don't say anything." Jordan didn't respond immediately. After a moment that Marcus described as enormously long, he simply said, "Because I don't need to." And then yes, for the first time that night, something changed in the way Jordan played. He didn't lower his guard. He didn't become careless. He did exactly the opposite. Jordan began to play in a way that Marcus described with a mixture of admiration and something approaching fear, as if he had been holding something back during the first minutes, intentionally measuring his own level against his opponents, and had decided at that moment to stop holding back. The next 3 points from Jordan fell with a speed that physically changed the atmosphere in the gym. It wasn't just athletic speed, although that was there too. It was cognitive precision. Jordan anticipated every movement of Isiah one step before it happened, positioned his body to block the routes Isiah preferred before Isiah chose them, created angles that shouldn't exist within the geometry of a basketball court. Isiah Thomas, at 31 years old, 4 All-Star games, 2 NBA championships, a Finals MVP, one of the 15 best point guards in basketball history, couldn't find a way to score freely against a man who knew him completely. And what was more brutal, according to Marcus, wasn't the score. It was that Isiah knew it. There was one specific moment that Marcus described as the core of that night, the moment that kept returning to him decades later when he tried to process what he had seen. Isiah managed to get past Jordan's guard, penetrated toward the hoop, and at the last second Jordan appeared from an angle that physically shouldn't have allowed him to be there, and blocked the shot without excessive physical contact, just positioning and timing. The ball fell to the floor. Isiah didn't pick up the ball immediately. He stood looking at the hoop for several seconds. Marcus couldn't see his expression from where he was standing, but he could see his shoulders. And he said that something in the posture of those shoulders, in the slight forward tilt, in the way the arms fell at the sides of the body, communicated something he had never seen in Isiah Thomas during 4 years of watching him face the most extreme pressures of professional basketball. The game ended 11-7. There was no dramatic scene at the end. There was no verbal confrontation, no celebration from Jordan, no gesture from Isiah that publicly acknowledged what had happened. Jordan picked up his jacket, said something low to the 2 people accompanying him, walked toward the door. At the threshold he stopped. Without turning fully, without looking directly at Isiah, he said something at a volume that Marcus from his position could barely hear. "Good competition." And he left. Isiah remained on the court for several minutes after the door closed. Marcus and the other 2 men stayed silent, not speaking, not asking. The only unspoken rule of those spaces was that no one asked anything of anyone when they weren't ready to give it. When he spoke, his voice was completely normal, without any audible emotion that Marcus could identify. "You know what the problem is with seeing him play in person?" Isiah said. "The problem is that you understand exactly what he is." Nobody responded. Isiah continued, "On television you can tell yourself stories. You can tell yourself that the camera exaggerates, that the editing creates things that don't exist, that the team context makes him look better than he is." He paused. "In person you can't tell yourself any stories." Marcus told me it took him years to fully understand what Isiah had meant by that. And when he finally did understand, the realization came in a way he didn't expect. It wasn't an admission of defeat. It was something more sophisticated and darker at the same time. It was the recognition of a man who had built his entire identity around being the best at what he did, facing the evidence that there existed someone in that same world for whom what he did was insufficient. Not because Isiah was bad, but because Jordan was something else entirely. And Isiah, with all his intelligence, with all his experience, with everything he had achieved and won and suffered to get where he was, could do nothing with that knowledge except carry it. The gym was demolished in 1997. Marcus told me he drove by the site in 2003, and there was no trace that anything had ever existed there. Just concrete and weeds and the distant noise of the highway. But somewhere in the memory of 5 living men, that wooden floor still exists. Those lines are still marked. That silence between 2 men who didn't greet each other and didn't say goodbye still resonates. I spent 3 years trying to verify what Marcus had told me. I found 2 of the other 4 present, one in Phoenix, one in Cleveland. Both confirmed the fundamental facts with minor differences in details, the kind of differences that make a story more believable, not less, because human memory is never identical when it is genuine. None wanted their name to appear. None would deny the story if someone asked them directly, but neither would they confirm it publicly. They explained it to me with a logic that has a peculiar integrity. It's not our story to tell. Jordan never spoke of that night. Isiah Thomas never spoke of that night. The rivalry continued in official terms. The Bulls eliminated the Pistons in the 1991 playoffs, the year before that private session, and again in 1992, a few weeks later. Isiah Thomas retired in 1994. Jordan continued building a legend that eventually became the measure against which every player who came after would be evaluated. But I still think about that wooden court on the outskirts of Detroit. I still think about Isiah Thomas sitting on the floor with his back against the hoop post, staring at the ceiling for 5 minutes of absolute silence, searching that ceiling for an answer it couldn't give him. And I still think about what Marcus told me at the end of our conversation, the last thing he said before we said goodbye, and that it took me weeks to stop hearing in my head. He told me, the part that nobody understands about that night is that Isiah was the braver of the two. Jordan accepted the challenge because he could win it, and probably knew it. Isiah sent it knowing he risked losing, and sent it anyway, because he needed to know, because living without knowing was worse than losing with the knowledge. That says something about Isiah Thomas that no statistic can capture. No championship, no MVP, no analysis of his career reaches that place. The courage to ask reality a question when you have genuine fear of the answer. Isiah Thomas asked that question in a private gym in Detroit in March 1992. The answer he received stayed with him for the rest of his career. And the decision to go anyway, to risk knowledge over comfortable ignorance, to prefer truth over the protective myth he could have told himself for the rest of his life, that is not defeat. That is another kind of mastery, one that the scoreboard cannot record.